All manifestations expressed by staff members of Fundação Getúlio Vargas and by participating guests represent exclusively their own opinions and thoughts, therefore do not represent the institutional position of FGV. We also reiterate that all those present here have agreed to participate in the event spontaneously and have authorized the use of their image for the live transmission as well as for the post-event video on FGV's official channels. Everyone present here agreed to participate in this event spontaneously, and with that, they authorize the use of their image for this transmission that will be available later on the official channels of FGV. Good afternoon for all. I'm very glad to introduce this seminar to present to mediate it, and we will this seminar propose to discuss the problems, the Dutch disease, the three plagues of Latin America: COVID-19, Dutch disease, and natural resource course. Okay, Latin American countries have to import. Just to make an introduction, Latin American countries have to import medical appliance, inputs in general. There is not enough social and technological and infrastructure and health professionals to face COVID-19. So COVID-19 hurts the whole world, but Latin America, yes, is even more affected by this pandemic because there is the fault of this because of this the lack of these conditions. Okay, and governments are performing poorly in general in Latin America. Okay, in COVID, and there are lots of explanations for this environment, but certainly Dutch disease, natural resource course, and are relevant to explain this environment and how the governments are facing COVID-19. Okay, so we are here today to discuss those questions. Okay, the impacts of Dutch disease and natural resource course on these economies and by consequence how they face COVID-19. Okay, so the speakers here today are Professor Luiz Carlos Bresser Pereira. He's emeritus professor at Getulio Vargas Foundation. Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, he is director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. And Gabriel Palma, he is also emeritus senior lecturer at University of Cambridge and professor at University of Santiago. And Fiona Tregenna, she is professor in the Department of Economics and Econometrics in the University of Johannesburg. Okay, I'm Nelson Marconi. I'm professor at the Getulio Vargas Foundation and coordinator of the Center for Studies on New Developmentalism that is organizing this seminar. It's a jointly seminar organized by our Getulio Vargas Foundation Center for Studies on New Developmentalism, Columbia's University Center for Sustainable Development, and the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Okay, thanks for Emma, thanks for Isabella, for Sonia, for Marina, for Vanessa, all our team. And then we start the seminar. Okay, everybody is watching us at YouTube. You see that there will be a link for questions. Okay, so each presenter you do a presentation of, if each speaker will do a presentation of 20 minutes. Okay, please, the maximum 20 minutes. Then we have more time to make a short question and answer session. Okay, and so you finish at 5 o'clock in Brazil, 4 o'clock on New York time. Okay, thanks for accepting to come to the seminar, Gabriel and Fiona and Professor Bresser. Also, first, Fiona, you do the first speak, and then please, Gabriel, Professor Gabriel, Professor Bresser, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Okay, Fiona, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to Nelson and the other organizers. Greetings from a cold winter evening here in Johannesburg. It's really an honor to be part of this panel with esteemed speakers. I visited FGV 10 years ago. I think it was in February 2010. So happy to be back virtually and hope to be back physically at some time in the near future. So let me share my screen here. I hope it's visible. So when I received the invitation for this webinar with this interesting topic of the 3 plagues, I guess it got me thinking about what is the connection between these 3 plagues, COVID-19, the Dutch disease, and the natural resource curse, beyond the fact that Bresser and Gabriel and Jeffrey Sachs have been working and making seminal contributions on the issues of natural resource curse and the Dutch disease, and we now happen to be in the era of COVID-19. So let's bring them together and call them 3 curses, or 3 plagues. Is there an organic link between these 3 phenomena? So the first issue which I would like to comment on is how do these 3 plagues connect with one another? And that will bring me to the issue of state capabilities. I'll then like to comment on premature deindustrialization, which I think is connected in particular to Dutch disease and to some extent to the natural resource curse. And lastly, to comment on the issue of technological upgrading. So when I looked at the invitation for this webinar and tried to conceptualize in my own mind how these phenomena relate with one another, I was thinking on the one hand of the natural resource curse, the Dutch disease, and to that I would add deindustrialization, and in particular premature deindustrialization. And then on the other hand, the current condition of COVID-19, both medically and economically. And obviously there are various ways in which these phenomena connect. But one thing which came to mind is the issue of state capabilities, the capabilities of the state as a mediator of outcomes in relation to the natural resource curse, Dutch disease, deindustrialization, as well as coronavirus. I'm not sure whether this is visible to the people who are listening, or whether part of it is blocked by the videos, but I cannot see it fully on my side. It's partially blocked by the
okay.
by the other panelists.
Okay, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay. I will just have to recollect my own slides. So here I was just trying to conceptualize in a way, analytically, how do these phenomena connect with one another? So I'm thinking in the first instance of state capabilities, which are obviously themselves an outcome of various other forces and factors, which I'm not getting into the determinants of that now. And the effects of those capabilities in terms of the ability of states to execute and to implement effective industrial policy, to manage natural resources in a way that doesn't become a curse, and so on. And the consequences of this for outcomes in relation to industrial development and structural transformation. In turn, the effects of this on growth and the distribution of income and wealth. And trying to link these to COVID-19, I would suggest that industrial and structural transformation outcomes affect the ability of states to manage COVID-19, both medically and economically, as well as growth and distributional outcomes have an effect on this. Perhaps a weaker feedback is to state capabilities, but state capabilities directly affect, obviously, the ability of the state to manage that. And I would also suggest a kind of feedback loop between the implementation of industrial policy, the management of rents and so on, and the effect of that backwards onto state capabilities. So thinking of this kind of conceptual framework for linking the 3 plagues which have been proposed in this webinar, when these take the form of a vicious cycle, as we see in many developing countries. So in cases where we have weak state capabilities, this leads to a failure to execute effective industrial policy, a failure to manage rents from natural resources in a developmental fashion and so on, which in turn weakens the state further. These kind of policy failures lead to a lack of structural transformation, to premature deindustrialization, to weak productive capabilities at firm level, at sector level, and so on, which in turn feed into weak economic growth, inequality. And I would suggest that where this vicious cycle is present, it leads to a failure of states to manage COVID-19 both medically and economically. I'm not suggesting in any way that this is the only determinant of the capacity to manage such a complex disease and economic fallout. Of course, there are many other factors, but I guess this is the conceptual framework for linking these plagues that have been proposed in this seminar. So perhaps just to illustrate it further, I'm presenting this evidence or these figures in a very anecdotal way. I'm not suggesting it makes a kind of a comprehensive scientific case. This is the data from today on deaths per million from COVID-19, just for selected developing countries. These are not the highest and the lowest, it's just selected examples. So here we have examples of countries which are suffering very badly in terms of deaths in proportion to their population. And here we have a sample of developing countries where deaths per million are really low. Now, obviously here, it's not comparing apples with apples. Countries are at different phases of the disease. In many African countries, the deaths remain very low because they're at an early stage of the disease. But I've avoided putting those up because we don't know the course of the pandemic in those countries. So yeah, obviously it's not a direct comparison, but the differences here are striking. For example, if we look at the case of Vietnam, given its geographical location, we would certainly have expected COVID-19 to have spread at an early stage. It's a developing country. It suffers from many of the similar problems that, for example, here in South Africa and other developing countries, we attribute the spread of the disease to. Cramped living conditions, lack of sanitation, lack of water, poor medical facilities, and so on. So all of the reasons why we would say in many other developing countries are ripe for the pandemic to spread, one would think would be ripe for it to spread in a country like Vietnam. But as of today, they don't have a single death. Not even one death reported from COVID-19. And similarly, we see very low figures. Ethiopia, perhaps this figure is still going to rise, but this is a poor country, and which had a relatively early exposure. So here we have very low figures, a completely different order of magnitude. Now, obviously, there's a complex set of factors determining these differences in healthcare systems, political economy, geographical location, exposure to international movements, and so on. And certainly I'm not suggesting to reduce it to any one factor. But one thing which I do want to draw attention to in the context of today's webinar is that all of these countries which I'm mentioning here have strong capabilities in industrial policy. They have different kinds of industrial policies, they have different kinds of governance systems and so on, but all of them have strong capabilities in industrial policy. Again, I'm not suggesting that all countries good in industrial policy have low mortality rates, not at all. But I think it's an interesting observation, at least for some countries. I think when we look at the countries which are suffering badly, it's really a mixed bag. Some of them do have at least some capabilities in industrial policy, but due to other factors, the nature of government and nature of the leadership and so on, there are obvious examples there, the outcomes have been terrible. So to try and build a more analytical argument as to how I would link these phenomena. When we consider what are the kinds of state capabilities that are relevant for economic development broadly, for structural change, for industrial development, and I would suggest as well for managing emergencies such as the current one. It's important to recognize that these are firstly, they're both technical capabilities and political economy capabilities in the political nature of the state. So this includes the nature of the articulation between the state and the market and with various fractions of capital, the ability of states to design and implement appropriate policies, the level of coordination between, vertically between various levels of the state, from national to provincial to and regional to local, and between the state and parastatal institutions. And I think very importantly, the agility of the state machinery in adapting both institutions and policies to changing conditions. So is the state nimble and flexible? So I would suggest that these kind of state capabilities have less to do with the absolute or even relative size of the state, but more to do with the nature of the state. So linking these then to more specifically, what are the kinds of state capabilities that make for the effective implementation of industrial policy? I won't go through all of these in detail, but these are some of the kinds of characteristics of the state that I would suggest make some states more successful in implementing industrial policy than others. The ability of the state to manage rents and to discipline capital, to regulate finance, the provision and the nature of development finance that is publicly provided, policy coordination between different spheres of policy, in particular between industrial policy and macroeconomic policy, and ensuring that industrial policy is not subordinated to macroeconomic policy. Obviously, the kinds of technical skills in designing, implementing, monitoring, and revising industrial policy rather than being stuck with policies which are not working. The ability to support upgrading of firm-level productive capabilities and technological upgrading, and the capacity to tolerate and to manage and to learn from failures. So I would suggest that these are some of the characteristics of states that make for the effective implementation of industrial policy. And I would suggest then that the types of state capabilities that make for the successful implementation of industrial policy are also important in managing COVID-19, both medically and economically. So some of the specific state capabilities that are needed are similar. If we think of the success of some countries in containing the pandemic, for example, through large-scale testing or tracking and testing, also the more direct industrial capabilities in terms of, for example, up-ramping industrial production of personal protective equipment and so on. And yeah, more broadly, being able to articulate effectively with firms, to work with them, with civil society and so on. It's a similar kind of capabilities are relevant to the effective implementation of industrial policy, to managing a crisis such as the current pandemic, and to some extent more broadly in terms of governance. I think beyond just recognizing the commonality in these kinds of capabilities, one could also recognize that implementing active industrial policies and doing it well also in turn assist in building up and improving these kinds of state capabilities. So states which have had decades of experience in providing incentives to firms and monitoring the effects of those and so on, targeting, those kinds of capabilities that get built up through effective industrial policy are also helpful more broadly in terms of governing. I'd then just like to move more specifically to issues of deindustrialization, premature deindustrialization, and technological upgrading, which I'll finish with. I'm going to go through this quite quickly. Perhaps Gabriel might also talk about some related issues here. So I just wanted to give a brief empirical overview of trends in industrial development internationally. Probably I need to update this chart, but I think the patterns are still going to be pretty consistent. So this is showing the share of manufacturing in total employment for different groups of countries. Here we have Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Middle East and North Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, East Asia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and North America. And for each group of countries, the bar is showing the share of manufacturing in total employment for the 5 time periods indicated there. So we can see here the extraordinary deindustrialization which has happened over at least half a century, in fact more, in the advanced economies. And the dramatic drop in the share of manufacturing in total employment that is clearly evident. We can also see that even after that half century of deindustrialization, manufacturing still remains at a similar level. For example, in North America and even in Western Europe, as compared to, for example, Latin America and other developing regions of the world. So even after such a long period of deindustrialization and the Rust Belt and so on, there's still a high degree of industrial capacity that is retained in those countries. When we look at the developing regions of the world, we see a very different picture, for example, for Sub-Saharan Africa and for South Asia, the 2 regions in which the low-income countries of the world are concentrated. So while in the case of South Asia, we see that the share of manufacturing on average is still increasing. There's a very different picture evident for Sub-Saharan Africa, where it's either stable or, if anything, or let's say stagnant, even starting to decline, but at an extraordinarily low level of industrialization. So this I've called pre-industrial deindustrialization, because in some of these low-income countries, we are seeing deindustrialization setting in before there's been even any meaningful sort of industrialization. I think the consequences of deindustrialization are probably well known to this audience. I think particularly from a kind of structuralist and a Caldorian perspective, deindustrialization brings reduced scope for cumulative productivity increases, learning by doing, and all of the other special characteristics associated with manufacturing, leading to weaker prospects of sustained growth and catch-up. Perhaps bringing it back to the link with the pandemic, the international literature suggests that there are also negative effects of deindustrialization on income distribution, on family and social cohesion, on health, poverty, and so on. Premature deindustrialization, Gabriel has been one of the leading people working on this, and I'm sure he will probably have more to say, is likely to have especially negative consequences. In the case of premature deindustrialization, less of the benefits of industrialization will have been captured by the time deindustrialization sets in. So even if one could make an argument for advanced economies, that there's a possibility of the services sector playing some kind of role as an alternative engine of growth, I think it's very difficult to suggest that, for example, in low and middle income countries that have barely even industrialized in some cases, there's almost no prospects of a dynamic services sector playing a role as an engine of growth. So lastly, I would like to link this through the lens of structural transformation with the importance of technological upgrading. So we can see innovation and technological upgrading in a way as the micro foundations of structural change. Technological upgrading are important for competitiveness, for the strengthening of productive capabilities, for increasing complexity, and really for all aspects of upgrading. Just wanted to mention a couple of new pieces of research that I think link in with this issue of technological upgrading. In a recent paper with Antonio Andrioni, published in Structural Change and Economic Development, we've expanded the notion of a middle income trap to a middle income technology trap, and suggested that keeping pace with technological change and innovation is crucial for for developing countries to avoid a middle income technology trap. More broadly, in a paper, a current paper with Elvis Avenio at Oxford, we've also looked at the environmental dimension of this and done an econometric analysis of emissions associated with manufacturing, but by level of technology intensity. And we found that obviously, while, as we know, industrialization as a whole is associated with harmful emissions, which are the key contributor to climate change, that these are much lower for high-tech manufacturing than for medium tech, and in turn for low tech, both when we look at this as a share of manufacturing value added and in terms of the composition of exports. So I think it's interesting in suggesting that technological upgrading is not only important for competitiveness and so on, but even from an environmental perspective. Lastly, technology intensity or technological upgrading is also relevant in a way of avoiding a path of deindustrialization. So what I'm showing here, I'm sure people are familiar with the classical inverted U curve of deindustrialization, in which countries' share of total employment tends to rise and then decline at high levels of income per capita. What I've done here is to show it for low-tech manufacturing in blue, for medium-tech manufacturing, that's the red dashed line, and for high-tech manufacturing, which is the black line. And what we find here is that for low-tech manufacturing, it follows the classic inverted U pattern. For medium-tech manufacturing, at high levels of income per capita, it flattens out, but we don't even see the declining part of the inverted U. And for high-tech manufacturing, it's basically a straight line as income per capita increases. So this suggests that even as countries become wealthier, for high-tech manufacturing, their share of total employment in high-tech manufacturing is actually monotonically increasing, and even to an extent with medium-tech manufacturing. So there is no stylized fact of deindustrialization for medium and high-tech manufacturing. The overall inverted U is explained by low-tech manufacturing, which obviously is the biggest proportion of total manufacturing. So whilst on the one hand it's not straightforward to upgrade to medium and high-tech manufacturing, otherwise everybody would be doing it, but this really underscores the importance of technological upgrading for countries. So I see that my time is up. Just very brief concluding remarks. I think I wanted to underscore the ongoing importance of structural transformation, of technological upgrading, and of building strong and relevant state capabilities. And I see these as very closely, organically connected to one another. And finally, it's well recognized that the post-COVID world, if we can look ahead to that, will be different in many ways. There will be crises in future, and there are the ongoing crises of climate change, of poverty, of inequality, and so on. So we really need to think more actively of what are the kinds of societies and economies that we want. What is the role of the state and of different actors in moving towards those, and what kind of interventions are required? Because everybody is thinking about what will post-COVID policies look like. It's not a given that those policies will be in any way more progressive. We know that elites are generally better able to protect their own interests during periods of crisis. And so the outcome of those policies are really going to be a product of contestation. Let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, for your excellent presentation. And now you have Professor Gabriel Palma, please. As I said, he is professor at University of Cambridge and also the University of Santiago. Okay, Professor Palma, please. It's a pleasure to receive you.
Mine. Thanks for the invitation to talk one of the subjects which are closest to my mind. I'm going to share the screen to can you see it okay? Okay, first what I want to say, talking about the industrialization in Latin America, it is important to grasp the dimension of the challenge ahead. Started for Brazil, compare Brazil and China, but let's see Brazil, which was the engine of manufacturing in Latin America. Brazil alone in the 70s produced about half of all the manufacturing that was produced in the South. If you take all Asia except for Japan, all the emerging countries and everybody else, Brazil produced about half of the total manufacturing of the South. Okay, so in 1980, okay, there were a lot of problems with Brazilian manufacturing, but I sure will buy a Brazilian car than an Indian car, or I will buy a Brazilian washing machine than a Chinese one, or I will fly an Embraer flight plane instead of a Russian one. So, I mean, no matter what problem we can find in Brazilian manufacturing, in 1980, Asia had it 10 times worse. So that is not a real excuse. If you see here, very briefly because of time, productivity in manufacturing in Brazil today is exactly the same of the 1970s. Exactly the same that about half a century ago. I mean, it's almost like when I see these figures, I want to look at other data sets. There must be wrong something here. And every data set you look is like that. If you look at employment, there has been a minor increase at some period. And output has been practically stagnant since neoliberal reforms. So we should, well, look at China, of course. I mean, although employment's been fairly stagnant for a long, look at productivity growth. I mean, this massive rate of growth of output is basically led by productivity. And this is the picture, the Brazilian picture is the same all over Latin America. Mexico is a small exception, but it's a lot of maquila, is just like assembly type of manufacturing and so on. And look at Chile and so on. So when we think about that we need to reindustrialize Latin America, we cannot forget the pharaonic dimension of the task, okay? So when we think at, oh, what's the role of exchange rate, what is the role of government lack of industrial policy and this or that, I mean, we have to think is that here in manufacturing, we have to reboot the whole thing. I mean, switch off the computer and reboot it. We have to really think about how the re-engineering has to be sort of major surgery, okay? And this is something that one really shouldn't lose the perspective. Now, something briefly about how important is manufacturing in growth as an engine of growth, which in this audience, I'm sure I'm preaching to the convert, but let's look at very briefly. If you look at if you compare Chile and Korea and look at catching up, where the frontier is, in this case, I chose United States, but could have been Germany or Japan, doesn't matter. How far the productivity, average productivity of the Chilean worker is compared to that of the frontier, okay? And the same of Korea. And if you can see the key characteristic of Chile in this pretty long period of time, it's nearly 70 years, okay? Is that is an unbelievable stability. Okay, massive amount of cycles, but basically today, the relative productivity of a Chilean worker vis-a-vis the US is the same that it was in 1950. That is, also remember, Latin America is the best performing country Chile is the best performing country in Latin America. Not a single country in Latin America today is where it was in 1980. Brazil is below, Mexico is below, Argentina is below, everybody else is below. So the big success of Chile is not to have moved backwards. It's at least it has stayed stable. So it is like if there was a glass ceiling here that we in Latin America don't know how to break. While look at Asia, Korea and Singapore is even faster. I mean, it's amazing not only how it closes the productivity gap, the catching up, but it's also how stable, how incredible the stability of that growth. So this is the key point. In Latin America, we all know how to grow. Every country in Latin America, Brazil 60, 70, Chile here 86, 98, we all have period in which we have grown at Asia styles, Asia speed, and so on. However, not a single Latin American country, not a single one, has been able to sustain that growth. It's not that Korea has grown at an average of, say, 55, 6% in the last 50 years. It's that it has grown at that time for 50 years. In Latin America, we are, as I always say, at best middle-income runners, like Chile, 86, 98. But eventually we run out of oxygen and we have to slow down. So is the key issue about the different Latin America and Asia is not that we don't know how to grow Asia style, is that when we do, we cannot sustain that growth in time. That is the key analytical challenge to understand. Also, the other thing, we don't have time, is the amount of cycles in Latin America. I mean, in Chile, we join every cycle that there is in the world economy, we join it. It's like a fashion. And look at Asia. It's not that they don't have financial crisis. Remember the 97, but you have to look at this with a magnifying glass in order to find it. In Latin America, I mean, also today, flexible exchange rate. I mean, every macro policy is almost designed to amplify the cycles instead of to dump them down. So here is something that is really analytically important. But if you look, and here is a kind of important point, because if we look at the relative position, productivity-wise, between Chile now and Korea, not with the US, but Chile and Korea. And what I do see here is something very simple. In 1980, whatever was the productivity differential per sector, Chile with Korea, that product difference, I call it 1 or 100. So if the graph goes up, it means that the Chilean sector, productivity-wise, is growing faster. And if we go down, is that the Korean sector is productivity-wise growing faster. And of course, unfortunately, mining is not there because Korea doesn't have any mining these days. But if there was mining, Chile, like that, like this other sector, will not be doing very badly. So what is the characteristic of the comparison of Chile and Korea? Is that if you, as I said, mining will be here. But if you look at agriculture, it has hardly fallen back. Today, productivity in Chilean agriculture is relative to Korea what it was in the 1980s. If you look at services, okay, a little bit down. It's like a football match in which Chile is losing just 1-0 on agriculture, on service, on construction. If you look at finances there, then, well, how is it that we have this kind of unbelievable contrast? Well, the answer is very simple. Look at the productivity gap between Chile and Korea manufacturing-wise. It has grown completely out of all proportion. What had done in Latin America, we in the neoliberal reforms, we basically threw in the towels. We have developed an interesting manufacturing sector with all the problems we know, but basically instead of us in Asia using reforms in a way to restructure that industrialization and give them more energy, we basically threw in the towel. We moved to an extractive dual economy model since then, and we have continued there. So at least the difference between Chile and Korea is 90% or 80% explained by the issue of that in Chile, we basically closed down business. The manufacturing sector that is left is only the one that is by necessity relatively tied to the consumption, to the consumer side of it. I mean, it's a bit difficult to import some of the sort of processed food that we eat in Chile, so they're produced in Chile. So basically, I mean, the importance of manufacturing, I think, is difficult to, first, the important manufacturing is difficult to overstate, and the challenge we have ahead to reindustrialize Latin America is also difficult to understate. Now, if you look at this graph, basically what I do here is that I see the relationship between the share of employment in manufacturing and the GDP per capita. It's in logs to simplify things. And what we have seen here, and this is the whole world, well, the 130 countries in which, or no, 102 countries that I have the data, and is the same set of countries, so to be systematic. And we can see that the relationship between employment and GDP per capita has been coming down in the world very clearly, 60, 70, 80, 90,000, so on. But also, sorry, Bresser, if you could switch off your mic, anyway, because we can hear your conversation. And also, as you can see, the turning point in the regression, remember Bob Rawson, my colleague at Cambridge, who started this type of thinking, he defined positive deindustrialization as the one that takes place after the turning point. Okay, but the turning point, it has moving leftward all the time. Here, during the industrialization was a monopoly of high-income countries. Here was high middle income, and by here it's just middle income. So not only the relationship between manufacturing, employment, and GDP has been coming down in time, but also the turning point has been moving to lower and lower income per capita countries. And the point I want to make is that if you think about that, clearly, and this is a way to understand the Dutch disease differently, the way that I propose, is that if you see that some countries in the world, like obviously Holland, but also the whole of Latin America, they have overshoot their fall. Holland not only has fallen like everybody else in terms of the share of manufacturing, but they have overshoot its fall in the share of manufacturing. So, and that normally is associated with the Dutch disease. Now, but what's going on? The key point here, and I'm really going fast because of time, is that if you look in the world, and this is for 1990, okay, there is a difference from, if you look at countries which are rich in commodities and countries which are poor in commodities. The rich in commodities are the red, the poor in commodities are the blue. You see that there's two patterns of industrialization, which is not surprisingly. If you don't have commodity and you have to import your oil and so on, you have to have other sectors who have a trade surplus so that you have the finances in order to cover the trade necessary trade deficits in commodity if you don't have commodity. So not surprisingly, the style or the pattern of industrialization in commodity poor country is more intense than the pattern of industrialization in countries which are commodity rich, just say poor, middle, or the rich countries. Now look at that. What we find is quite interesting. The degree of the industrialization throughout the advanced and middle income countries has been the same if in commodity poor countries than in commodity rich countries. In relative terms, commodity rich countries have not deindustrialized more than commodity poor countries. It's amazing how in relative terms, both the industrialization had been exactly the same. And this is something that really needs a lot of thinking about it. But going back to the Dutch disease, and that is my definition of the Dutch disease. If you look at Netherlands, yes, it has fallen massively, its share of manufacturing, employing manufacturing. But what has actually happened is that it started as a commodity poor country and ended up as a commodity rich country. Its present level of employment as share of the total employment, manufacturing employment in the total, is exactly what you would expect for a commodity rich country. So my definition of the Dutch disease is that the extra degree of the industrialization that Holland has had because of changing groups from commodity poor to commodity rich, meaning instead of falling from the blue to the blue, it has fallen from the blue to the red. So that in fact can even be quantified easily. Is the Dutch disease is not that Holland has deindustrialized, because Germany and France, everybody else has industrialized, is that how much extra has Holland industrialized because it's moved from commodity poor to commodity rich country. And you can see that Holland is exactly what it's supposed to be, given that it's commodity rich. And what happened in Latin America is very interesting, because Latin America, although we are commodity rich, in the import substituting industrialization period, we were industrializing as if we were commodity poor. So basically, the whole Previch structurally thinking is that we want to have our cake and eat it. We wanted We were commodity rich, but we also wanted to industrialize as if we were commodity poor. So we wanted to have the best of both worlds, the advantage of the commodity rich and also the advantage of the engine of growth of manufacturing as if we were commodity poor. So what happened in Latin America is not that we discovered national resources. It's not that we suddenly moved as Netherlands from commodity poor to rich. We were commodity rich and we continue to be commodity rich, except that the neoliberal reforms had brought us where we were supposed to be in a Ricardian sense. There is what you are supposed to be if you are commodity rich and you want to accept passively that factor. There is no necessity. Like before, we wanted to do more. Today, there's no reason why we wanted to do more. The point I want to make is that it's very easy to understand why Latin America has deindustrialized, because we threw in the towel on the previous process on the industrialization, and we move entirely to commodity extraction and services and so on, and completely abandon manufacturing. But why in this new form of doing things, there hasn't been an industrialization agenda? One can think, even from a Ricardian perspective, that Chile should have industrialized its commodity. Remember, just the transport cost of bringing copper concentrate to China is fantastic. 70% of all transatlantic cargo ships that goes from Chile to Korea, they bring just rubbish. They just bring the slag of the mineral, because concentrate only have 30% copper content. So the over 100,000 cargo ships that go from Chile to India every year, 70% of the 700 of them, they just simply slag. This is our great contribution to global warming and all the unnecessary pollution for that transport of those concentrates. So if we did it in Chile, we had the great advantage of that reduction in transport costs. So there is one could have expected that here there was a new industrialization agenda. In this new Ricardian position, there would be an industrialization agenda. And what I want to do here in the time I got left, I want to look very specifically some of the obstacles to do that. Because obviously there has been lack of industrial policy, there has been government which in the new type of thinking, and they're completely emasculated government that they should be completely neutral in their policy. I mean, we know a lot about why, but there is one extra point, which is at least the objective side of why it is difficult to have industrialized in terms of adding value added to our commodity export. Because if you look at the countries which have done okay in terms of their industrialization of primary commodities, like Australia, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and so on, what is their characteristic? Is that their investment per workers are the highest in the world. Australia, as investment per worker, does more than Singapore, high-tech countries, and certainly more than Korea. The same with Finland, Denmark, and Sweden, and Norway. So, and look at Chile where we are. If we want to be serious in terms of industrializing commodities, our investment per worker, which is only $7,000 per worker, which by the way is the highest in Latin America. Today, Brazil, investment per worker is below what it was in real terms in 1980. Below 1980. In the meantime, Korea multiplied by 5, other East European countries, East Asian emerging countries by 6, 7, 8, and so on, China by 20. Brazil today, investment per worker is below what it was in 1980. Can anybody think that you can industrialize like that? Mexico, with all the foreign investment, today investment per worker in Mexico is below what it was in 1980. Argentina below. So the average Latin America, of course, is below. Chile is the exception, is marginally above, but still 7,000. But the key characteristic of industrialization of commodities has two characteristics, and both are rather complicated. One is extremely capital intensive. Now, countries in Latin America have had an unlimited access to finance. It's not that this has been an unsurmountable problem. Access to finance has been unlimited, and I can discuss later on in the discussion what they have done with this finance. Chile today, the corporate debt as a share of GDP is the largest in the whole emerging world, in more than China, Turkey, and so on. And there is nothing to show for it. It's basically, it has financed horizontal diversification on neighboring countries. If you produce copper concentrate instead of putting a foundry and make copper bars, you move to the next door neighbor country to do copper concentrate. If you export good chips, instead of moving to MDF, you move to Argentina to do the same wood chip, or to Brazil to do the same third quality pulp industry and so on. So it's not problem of finance, it's problem of how that finance has not been directed to the commodity industrialization in Chile. But we cannot forget that the challenge of that manufacturing strategy, which I think is the only one in Latin America, plus of course the green issue, how to transform the green issue from problem to solution, transform the Chilean agriculture in organic, energy production in clean and sustainable and so on. But the other side of the industrialization is about commodity, but we cannot forget how capital intensive. But the second characteristic of those markets is that if you move in Chile from copper concentrate to bars and bands to wire, that buyer is like a commodity. You can sell it in the spot market, meaning the manufacturing commodity, at least in the sort of first stage of manufacturing, are very homogeneous. And a country where you sell homogeneous product obviously is more competitive, and there are no rents other than innovation, which is certainly not our forte, but that homogeneous product in competitive market, there are no rents and operating profits are not very high. So the challenge of the move is one should not also underestimate. Capital intensive, no rents, and other than innovation, which is not, as I said, our forte, and just operating profit, which in competitive market are not very great. So we shouldn't forget that we start really from a horrendously backward position. Remember the graph on Brazil. But also the challenge ahead is very capital intensive, and initially at least in homogeneous competitive markets where no rents, just operating profit, which are not very high. So we really need industrial policy. We really need trade policy. We really need to stop this absurd horizontal diversification in Chile. As I said, Chilean corporate debt is the highest in the world, in the emerging world, as a share of GDP. And all the asset associated with that debt is investment that Chilean companies have done in neighboring countries, and now even in the US, simply to move horizontally. From copper concentrate here, copper concentrate there. From wood chip here to wood chip there. Anything other except going up in the value chain. So obviously, some capital control to the exit of these investments is obvious. I mean, that's what Asia has done. And I don't know if I have a minute, but if you look at the whole world here, all countries, there is data.
Just a minute, please, Professor. Yes.
Okay. Basically, if you look at what has happened in Latin America, is that if you look at employment growth and productivity growth from 80 to 2008, here, this is a world average. What we have is the whole of Latin America is in the quadrant 2. Basically, amazingly capable of producing employment growth in very low productivity and low productivity potential product like service and so on, but practically no productivity growth. The average Latin America is 0. And every time that a country like Chile managed to move from 2 to 3, basically we run out of oxygen, as it happened in Chile in 1980, and we come back to 2. To a quadrant in which we are capable of producing a lot of not very interesting employment, but we are completely unable to have some decent productivity growth. This is our home, Latin America natural home. I mean, every time we come out, there is a gravitational force. I mean, like the sort of attraction to the abysm that bring us home, and our home is quadrant 2. high employment creation in not very important, interesting products, which are very nice, but the growth-wise are not very interesting, but very little productivity growth. And that has a lot to do with manufacturing. So we can grow, but we cannot sustain that growth. We have thrown in the towel on manufacturing, and the challenge of the re-engineering should not forget how backward we are now and how capital intensive and complex is the process of industrializing commodities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Palma, for your very interesting presentation with new data, and the questions you posed we also want to discuss later in the seminar. Please, next is Professor Bresser Pereira. Please, is Emeritus Professor of Getulio Vargas Foundation. Welcome, Professor Bresser. Yeah,
okay.
Yes.
I'm very pleased to be here with you, and particularly with my old friend, Jeffrey. I'm going to read what I wrote, what I am going to speak, because for me this is very important, and so I decided to read. We are here today discussing the Dutch disease and the insufficient growth of Latin America and Africa when compared with East Asia. We are here because 1 year ago, I asked myself how to wake up these two continents to the Dutch disease, how to wake up to the Dutch disease problem, the United Nations, the World Bank, the economists and politicians who are committed to growth and catching up of developing countries. And the answers that I gave to myself to this question were four. First, I should insist that the Dutch disease represents a major competitive disadvantage, not only to the existing, but also to the planet manufacturing companies in countries exporting commodities. Second, I should argue that the main reason why Latin American countries stop growing, while East Asian countries, mainly South Korea and Taiwan, are today rich countries, are not the middle income trap, but what I call the liberalization trap. Third, change your proposal. I must change my proposal on how to neutralize the Dutch disease. Change from a variable tax on exports of the commodities to also an import tariff and export subsidies on manufactured goods. Very unorthodox. And four, telling to myself, persuade a highly recognized and leading policy advisor who knows well the problems to assume the leadership of this battle to wake up the countries to the Dutch disease. Call your old friend, Jeffrey Sachs. And was that what I did? When I put the problem to Jeff 1 year ago, he proposed me this meeting, which should be happening in São Paulo at this time of the year. But the COVID-19 made impossible the presential workshop. And here we are in a webinar. And here I am ready to argue for the wake up to the Dutch disease battle. A battle that must be fought and won if you want to build a more even and balanced world. I will discuss now my 3 points. First, the Dutch disease represents a major competitive disadvantage. The market is an insuperable institution for coordinating competitive economic systems, but on the one condition, that all players compete in equal conditions. Market allocate wonderfully the factors of production when there is competition, but we cannot speak of competition when in a given market, some players which are equal in technical capability are in clear disadvantage in commercial terms because their exchange rate is overvalued in the long term. If before the game is played, there was not the leveling of the playing field, we cannot speak of a real market competition. What is the Dutch disease? It's a fundamental market failure existing in countries that export mainly commodities. In these countries, the exchange rate that makes competitive the existing or potentially existing, this is important, potentially existing manufacturing companies is substantially more depreciated than the current equilibrium. The other is the industrial equilibrium. The exchange rate that makes competitive the exports of commodities. This happens, the current equilibrium is more appreciated than the industrial equilibrium, not only when the prices of these commodities are in a boom, but also permanently because their production may benefit from recurrent rents. In the case of exporters of oil, when its production costs is very low, the country may suffer the disease even when the prices of the oil are relatively low. Well, this is the Dutch disease, and this is a competitive disadvantage. These are serious, very serious problems for existing and potentially existing companies. I am calling it is an obstacle to manufacturing companies, but this is a simplification. It is an obstacle to the companies producing tradable, non-commodity goods and services that are for sure sophisticated, have higher value added per capita, and pay higher wages and salaries. Well, then the liberalization trap. We can see the consequence of this competitive disadvantage comparing the Latin American and the East Asian countries. Here you can see in the graph that is presented, East Asia and Latin America grows between 1954 and 2019. Look that up to 1980, both regions were more or less the same. Maybe South Korea, East Korea, a little better, but not much. After that, the difference is enormous. Latin America stagnates, while East Asia continues to grow strong and strong. When in the 80s, the Latin American countries stopped catching up, while the East Asian countries continued to grow, they didn't fall in the middle income trap that became very popular among several economists. But I propose that they came to the liberalization trap. The upholders of the middle income trap used quite wide income intervals to define what was the middle income country, and did not explain the exception represented by the Eastern Asian countries. Well, there is an explanation that I believe to be relatively consensual for the difference. The East Asian countries invest more in education than the Latin American after the war. Thus, when the progress of industrialization required a more educated manpower and more engineers, these Asians were more prepared for this challenge than the Latin American countries. Okay, this is an explanation important, but I don't think that's enough, nor it is the more important. To me, to explain what happened, we need a historical new fact that happened in Latin America and not in East Asia. Up to the 80s, the two regions were growing at approximately the same level. We need a negative historical fact in Latin America that explains what happened after. Some major determinants of economic growth do not fall in this category. Existence of institutions that guarantee property rights and contracts, investment in infrastructure, creation of financial systems able to finance investment. All this is very important, but there was no difference before and after 1980. I propose that the major new historical fact was that in the late 80s, the Latin American countries stopped neutralizing the Dutch disease. They dismantled the mechanism that neutralized the Dutch disease by liberalizing their foreign trade, while the East Asian countries did not have the Dutch disease. So they didn't need to neutralize it. From this moment on, the Latin American countries face a major competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis not only these Asian, but to all rich countries. Well, but how then Latin America, this is the third point, how Latin American countries neutralized the disease before the 80s. Before the 80s, and I would say up to today, that's a sad thing, the Latin American countries did not know the Dutch disease. The first model of the disease is the Cordens and Neris 1982 model. The papers by Jeffrey Sachs dated from the 90s. My own paper with the new model of Dutch disease, where you have two equilibriums, the industrial and the current, was published in 2008. Nevertheless, this is very interesting, the Latin American countries neutralized intuitively, pragmatically, the Dutch disease. And I believe that this was also made by the Americans and the Norwegians. Remember that the Americans, I'm not going to stand for this, kept very high import tariffs until 1939. Was not because of the infant industry. Except the Norwegians, they did not adopt the more technical way of neutralizing the disease, the method that I derived from my model, by imposing a variable tax on exports of the commodity, variable according to the international price of the commodity. This is the ideal policy, but we cannot come to it intuitively, and we cannot came at a phone, I'm sorry. And you cannot and when this part of commodity is agricultural, it becomes politically difficult to adopt it due to the large number of producers, and they resist for sure to attacks like that. What the policymakers in Latin America did was a second best neutralizing policy. The policymakers at this time were developmental policymakers who highly believed that to grow in a sustainable way and make the catching up, the country must industrialize. And it was clear for them that to industrialize, the countries required import tariffs on manufactured goods. Thus, they did that and successfully neutralized the disease in the domestic market. Only the adoption of this policy may explain the successful industrialization of many Latin American countries between 1950 and 1980. To export, the capable companies continued in disadvantage. In Brazil, this was solved with enormous success in 1967. From this year to 1990, the manufacturing companies counted with an export subsidy that made them internationally competitive. To have an idea of the success, in 1965, the exports of manufactured goods represent only 6% of all exports. 20 years later, they represented 62%. 62% now has fallen. The argument that they had for the tariffs was the old Hamiltonian argument of the infant industry, a good argument that legitimized import tariffs, but only for a time. When in 1987, I was finance minister of Brazil, I learned that the average import tariff was 45%. And I immediately decided to begin the preparations of the opening of the economy. The manufacturing industry in Brazil was not infant, and such protectionism was unacceptable for me. I was wrong, because I also didn't know the Dutch disease, because I didn't know that there is a second thing that legitimizes import tariffs besides the infant industry argument. And the second thing that does not make them protectionist. In 1990, Brazil opened its economy. Other Latin American countries did the same around this year. In doing that, they dismantled the mechanism that neutralized the Dutch disease. And from this year on deindustrialization and quasi-stagnation defined the 40 following years, except Mexico as to the industrialization. But almost the whole Mexican industry was transformed into a maquila and played the role of commodities in blocking the productive sophistication of the country. In the case of Brazil, the deindustrialization was enormous, as figure 2 shows. Gabriel Palma presented in this webinar impressive figures showing how productivity stagnated in Latin America once the region stopped to neutralize the disease, and how investment per worker stagnated, if not has fallen since 1908 in the region. In Brazil, the investment per workers in real terms is smaller than it was in the 1980, tells Palma. And quasi-stagnation followed. The Brazilian economy, which has grown at a 4.5%, we should know, see the graph, the figure, and the quasi-stagnation followed. The Brazilian economy, which has grown at a 4.5% a year between 1950 and 1980, from this year to 2019, has grown just at 0.7%, 4.5 to 0.7. Quasi-stagnation following behind. In the same period, the growth per capita in rich countries was 1.6, and in developing countries, including China, 3%. In Brazil, 0.7. The Dutch disease and the natural resource curse. The Dutch disease is usually associated to the natural resource curse, a cultural and political problem. Countries that suffer the disease, chiefly when it is originated from the exports of oil and the capability of the state to assure the rule of law and the relatively low level of corruption is faltering, these countries are often called rentier countries, and the politicians, bureaucrats, and even businessmen are reduced to rent-seeking. This is a real problem. This disease is feeding the curse making more difficult the neutralization of the disease. But a major mistake is which political scientists and some liberal economists incur is to ignore the disease, which has a relatively simple way of checking, and just looking for the curse. That's very difficult to resolve. How much control the COVID-19 sanitary crisis depends on the Dutch disease and on the natural resource curse? For sure, it depends on the level of growth of the country, but not directly. Rich countries like the United States are showing a worse performance than some developing countries. Different is the case of the natural resource. It may lead the more affected countries to the condition of a predatory state, which, besides many other things, will be a major obstacle to face the COVID. What's to be done? How to make Latin America and Africa, which are mainly exports of commodities, to the problem of the Dutch disease? By debates like this, and by the intervention of the international organizations in this debate. What's to be done? In the case of oil exporters, the increase of taxes on the production of the commodity is probably the best way. In the case of exporters of agricultural commodities, the easiest solution, the more politically viable policy, is to create a linear tariff on the imports of manufactured goods, a tax with a unique variable rate tied to the average international price of the main commodities that the country exports. As we see, the solution to the problem is simple and clear. What's not easy for people to understand the problem, particularly when you are orthodox economists for whom industrialization is not required to have growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bresser Pereira, for your excellent presentation. I just want to remember before I introduce Professor Jeffrey Sachs, is that we have a link that is available on the YouTube below, right below the video. And then in this link, you can ask questions, and then you send the questions to the speakers, and then you answer them before the presentations. Okay, the link is right below the video. Okay. Okay, next speaker is Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University. It's a pleasure to receive you here, and I'm very proud of this webinar, and to you to accept to organize this with us. And please, you can do your presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. Nelson, thank you very much. And Luis Carlos, I'm so grateful that we're engaged in this together. It's, as you said, not as we hoped it would be. We were supposed to be arm in arm together in Sao Paulo, and we'll do that sometime very soon, I hope, in the post-Trump, post-Bolsonaro world that we look forward to. You know, part of my goal for a long time has been convergence, that our countries should grow together, and we are achieving startling convergence. The United States is becoming Brazil, and Brazil is becoming the worst part of the United States, I'm afraid. And we really are so much alike now, Brazil and the United States, in our terrible politics, our despicable presidents, our inability to control this epidemic, our rampant inequality, our lawlessness. It's shocking to me, but this is really what we're grappling with. We're grappling with a major, really a profound cultural crisis beyond everything else. And I really want to talk about that, because while state capacity, as Fiona was saying very rightly, is very important, I think social capacity is even really lurking beyond this story. Our societies are so divided, and I would include South Africa, of course, in that. If you think about the US, South Africa, Brazil, we lack social capacity, because our societies grew up as conquest societies, and we've never really gotten over this. And in the United States, we're still fighting the Civil War. We're still governed by a white supremacist, evangelical Protestant part of our society. Trump has no values, so I won't describe values to him, but he has an electoral base. And it is really a cultural crisis that we're facing. That's why the US has 150,000 deaths right now. It's unbelievable. A country filled with thousands of public health experts, epidemiologists, everything one could imagine in the world, and yet we can't even one day, literally one day, since the start of this epidemic, have an honest discussion at the federal level about it. It's a complete collapse culturally, not even politically. It's worse than that. It is fundamentally about inequality. Now, 30 years ago, when I started writing about the Dutch disease, we noted that countries with high resource endowments tended to grow more slowly. But it was also clear, even then, it wasn't an iron law. And in fact, there were several success stories, the US being one of them, in fact, for a long time. Canada being another. Australia, Norway. So it's not a mechanistic process by any means, but it is a tendency. And I'm inclined to think that the tendency is really about the context of those natural resources more than anything else. If they are really there to be plundered by a minority group, whether it's white settlers in South Africa going after the gold and the diamonds, or the European settlers in Brazil, or the American slave owners in the United States. You get certainly something worse than a Dutch disease, but you also get a Dutch disease, which is a development pattern where the choice is to live on the natural resource rents. If the same resource base and endowments are in a different kind of sociocultural context, Norway discovers natural gas, or Canada, which fortunately for Canada escaped the slave syndrome and slave disaster, or Australia, which basically murdered the indigenous populations enough so that they're a tiny proportion of the population, only 3% today. You don't get the Dutch disease the same way. You still have the resource endowments, but there's enough sense in the society that you can't live off of those resources. You have to build the society more generally. And building the society more generally is really education and technological capacity. And this is what always has been the shortcoming of highly divided societies. Whites did not want to educate Blacks in Africa, in South Africa. And in the US and Brazil, we had the two longest running slave societies in the world. I think Brazil basically takes the cake, 1888, and the United States was the only country I know of in the world that had to fight a civil war to end slavery. I live in a nasty country, by the way. It's just, there's really a dark side to it, which is extraordinary. Even South Africa gave up apartheid without a civil war. Brazil gave up slavery without a civil war. The United States needed a bloody war with 500,000 people dead as of 1865 to end slavery, because this is deeply entrenched in America, and it's deeply entrenched in the American religion, which is white Southern Protestant evangelical religion. Okay, so I think so much depends on the social context in which these resources are found, because the way out of the Dutch disease fundamentally is a diversified economy that is based on education, human skills, and technological advance. And that depends on a functioning society. That depends on broad-based education, broad-based skills, broad-based sense of the public good. And while I don't want to over glorify Australia or Canada, there's a lot more of that than there is in the United States, South Africa, and Brazil in history. So I thought I would show just a few pictures and pick 3 paradigmatic countries, but we've already seen them. One is Brazil, one is Australia, and one is Korea. So Korea is the quintessential case of nearly homogeneous society, no natural resources at all. Brazil, vast natural resources, deeply divided society that is really a conquest society, like the US and South Africa too. And Australia is also, in a way, a conquest society. Of course, it was a labor camp originally, but basically white European settlers conquered Australia and so profoundly suppressed the indigenous populations that it became basically ethnically not homogeneous, but nearly so. But without those deep divisions that characterize our 3 countries. And I think that it's worth looking, therefore, oops, I need to share my screen first, just at a few comparative points on that, looking at the 3. So like all of us, I also started with the epidemic. These are the number of new cases per day in Brazil, which is in orange at the top. Hundreds of new cases per day, between 100 and 200, basically an epidemic out of control because a president who didn't have the slightest capacity or interest in actually controlling it. Australia below in blue, and Korea basically controlling the epidemic from the very start. This is social capacity. The United States tracks the Brazil schedule, by the way. We're basically the same. It's not about wealth or anything else. Actually, many poor countries have contained the epidemic. Vietnam is another one. It's a matter of the social cohesion to do so. I mean, and my measure of how divided American society is that wearing a face mask became a major political divide. That is one crazy culture. If you think that wearing a face mask is left-wing and not wearing a face mask is patriotic, nationalist, right-wing, you're in an insane country, and I am in an insane country, by the way. So we know the story, per capita GDP, Australia, overcame its, or one could even say benefited from its resource wealth by becoming a high technology, diversified economy that also sells a lot of primary commodities to the world, including its despicable coal, but basically it's a highly diversified economy. South Korea, which we know was very, very poor after the Korean Civil War, and indeed after Japanese colonial rule from 1905 to 1945, became a technology giant. And of course, it is true that the anti-Dutch disease played a role. They have nothing. They have no natural resources at all, so they have to find a way to import everything. But the almost a maniacal focus on technological upgrading and education really characterized the Korean story from the start. And I remember going to Samsung. I was taken to Samsung in 1985 when they just had a few $1 billion of exports, and they told me what they were going to do and how they would export $10 billion at some time in the future. And it was, they were completely committed to somehow climbing the technology ladder, which they knew to be the essence of what development would be. At a macro statistical perspective, Korea achieved the most rapid growth with a super high investment rate. Australia, a moderately high investment rate. Brazil with a chronically low investment rate during this period. It makes sense. Brazil was not developing outlets of internationally competitive manufacturing, whereas Korea was doing nothing but that, and Australia was somewhere in the middle. But I think what's really critical here is the R&D share of GDP. Korea knew from the start, and sorry, I didn't label the legend properly, but it's again, the green line is Korea at the top. Korea, even from a very low level of development, invested massively in research and development. They knew that technology was their thing. Australia, moderate, between 1 to 2% of GDP up to the early 2000s, and then about 2% of GDP. Brazil, nothing, and Brazil has made some important technological advances, and it can do it for sure. And some of Brazil's agriculture is incredibly sophisticated. Brazil basically owns the world coffee market, the Arabica coffee market, because of its technological sophistication. But in general, Brazil did not aim for a high technology economy, or let's put it this way, didn't invest in a high technology economy. Oops, same picture. And this is the PISA score for 15-year-olds. The average score of 15-year-olds on math, science, and reading. And of course, Korea is green. It's at the top of the list. In fact, if you look at the list of high-performing countries in secondary level education, it's China, Singapore, Macau, Hong Kong, Estonia, Japan, South Korea, Canada, Taiwan, Finland. It's Northern Europe and Northeast Asia as the super high performing education. The United States and Australia, mediocre. We live on our resource base also and have pretty mediocre education levels on average. All of South America, in fact, Latin America from Mexico all the way through South America, very poor performance on education. And so South America's characteristic, Brazil is exemplary of this, but it's really true of the whole region, is that education quality is quite low. Investments in R&D are very low. The region doesn't aim for technological advance. It doesn't think about technological advance. It produces many scholars. It produces actually many great scientists, but not so many engineers and not so much technological advance. And in general, the education systems are really miserable. And South Africa isn't counted here, but we know South Africa's educational performance is absolutely miserable also. I mean, that's a tragedy of a long, long legacy. Well, I think that a huge amount of this really is about inequality, and not only inequality of income and wealth, but inequality of power by ethnic groups. Brazil is the Gini coefficient at the top of the curve. Australia is moderate inequality. South Korea, though in the data that I grabbed didn't have a long data set, still lower inequality. I think we're suffering basically from social incapacity at a fundamental level. Brazil does not see itself in much of its political history as a unified country. And right now it's as divided as can be. The United States certainly sees itself as a culturally deeply divided country and one that has been at race war for a huge amount of time. And I think in that context, it's probably extremely difficult to have the general commitments to education and technological excellence to overcome all of the other obstacles of governance that Fiona talked about, the state capacity and so on. State capacity at some level depends on social and cultural capacity. That is on the capacity to see one's own society as a unified society with a common purpose and a common interest and a common will. And I think that this is what's so devastating about high inequality, especially in its historical context. The rich are just not interested in the rest of society. And the result is that we never develop. We develop a state capacity that is a capacity to keep others down or to prevent them from expressing their displeasure, not a state capacity to develop all of society. So this is my short introduction, and we'll turn it over to discussion.
Thank you, Professor Sachs, for your brilliant presentation. Now we still have around 20 minutes to discuss. So we have some questions from the audience, and I will present one question for each of the speakers, okay? So I will just request to be brief on the answer, so you have more time to make a final to make a final speech of each one, okay? A small speech, and then I will start in the order of presentations, okay? The first one will goes to Fiona. There is a question for you. It's Europe is doing the EU Green Deal, and they are investing a lot on clean and circular economy. What are the similar possibilities to Latin America? This is the question for Fiona, okay? And then to Professor Palma. It's also a question. There are lots of people interested in environment questions here. It's fine. And you, to Gabriel Palma, Professor Palma, you mentioned climate change. What are the options to Latin America to work with local markets, selling and buying to or from Latin American countries, emitting less GHG with GHG gas, yes, and with transportation, there is greenhouse gas, and with transportation and circulating capital in the region, okay? To Professor Bresser, there are two questions, but I will choose one for you that I think is more linked to your presentation. How to put exchange rate at the right place? Taking exports not feasible in practice. What industries to foster? Brazil will not produce ships. Okay. And Jeffrey Sachs has more than one question also, but I need to choose some question. Yes. Sachs mentioned that we are living a cultural crisis. Even with Trump's response to COVID, there is still a high chance for him to be reelected. What do you think are the consequences of that to the world, to the pandemic, to values, and to values? How can we overcome this crisis in future? Yes, I think these are the most general questions now, and then I can, if you answer that, and then you can also open again to a few debate between you or to finish the presentation. Okay, please, Fiona, first. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think I'll comment in the broader context of developing countries, because I'm not an expert on Latin America. The question referred to the Green New Deal, and I guess the relevance of that for Latin American developing countries more broadly. I think it's clear that the green transition is an economic, a social, a moral, a survival imperative that really, it's not a luxury for countries. Obviously, it poses particular challenges for late industrializers, because in the earlier phases of industrialization, climate change was not a central concern, and they pursued industrialization paths that were harmful to the environment without the imperative of mitigating climate change that now all countries must face. But obviously the burden cannot be imposed consistently across countries. That would be wrong. I think in the case of developing countries, it's important to look at not only the constraints, but the opportunities that the green transition raises. So for example, in the new paper of ours that I referred to, we're looking at the possibilities of technological upgrading as an aspect of a green industrialization path. I think it's crucial for firms and for developing countries broadly to look at what are the opportunities that arise for both new products and new ways of producing products in such a way that we are not only the consumer of those, but can also be the producer and even at the cutting edge. That's easier said than done, and it's not something that we have any hope of accomplishing without massive public and private investments in new technologies, new production processes, and so on. And I think active industrial policy is a key part of that. Let me leave it there.
Nelson, you're mute.
Thanks. Professor Gabriel, please, and the answer for our question.
A couple of points that will lead me to the answer of the question. Let me share the screen first. This issue that Jeffrey was talking about, the reverse, what I call the reverse catching up. Look at this reverse catching up is going on. He was talking about US and Brazil. Look at the market Gini. We don't have data on decile, so we cannot use the Palma ratio, but using the traditional Gini, look at the market inequality of Chile and the market inequality of Germany. Remember globalization, we all were going to converge. Yes, of course, but we're converging the other way around. Is the middle income, the highly inequality middle income country, which show in the advanced countries the image of their future. It's not the other way. So what I like to tell my American and European friends, welcome to the third world, okay? This is basically what's going on. I mean, we are certainly converging, but we are not converging in the way that the Washington consensus was telling us that we were going to converge. The second point that, so it will lead me to the answer, so is the following. When I show this, that the challenge about the industrialization of commodities, in the sense that it's a very capital-intensive activity and in relatively competitive market, homogeneous product, no rents and low operating profits. This is also what I think a bit following Jeffrey's work. This is another part of the national resource curse. Part of the national resource curse is that if you want to take commodities as the engine of your growth via industrialization, it's not a minor challenge. Financially, it's a huge challenge because it's capital intensive, but also it's, I mean, you require to move into these markets which are not highly profitable. So the return on that investment, at least in the initial process, are not something to write home about. They're relatively. So another way to look at the resource curse hypothesis of Jeffrey is that even if you do things rightly, you don't fall in the national resource curse in the sense that he's working. Part of the national resource curse is that to get ahead is a challenge which is not a minor one. Look at the capital intensive industry. I mean, the degree of capital intensity of industrializing commodities is even larger than the East Asian models of Singapore and Korea, okay? So, but the only positive thing here is that the technologies to do that are fairly mature. I mean, obviously Chile can put a foundry and change concentrate into copper bars and copper bars into wire. I mean, it's not rocket sciences, okay? The technologies are there and mature, so that's not the obstacle. The obstacle is, of course, ideologically, and the obstacle is that the reluctance of moving into these relatively competitive, not highly profitable markets. So the domestic and foreign corporations prefer the horizontal diversification on doing the same in the countries next door, that to actually do something there. And also remember Korea, when Korea started in 1960, a third of the population was illiterate. Its main export products were silk and seaweed. I mean, obviously, and also it was not doing that bad. It's just that their intelligentsia, their politics, and their entrepreneurs realized that Latin American way of getting ahead with commodities was obviously not the best one, and they moved into the industrialization process, but they didn't wait until they had got into the PISA result they got today. They didn't wait until they got institutional setting for wonderful industrial. They didn't. No, I mean, you have to get. I mean, you have to jump into the swimming pool and somehow learn swimming, as opposed to have this endless, like in Latin America, endless classes of how to learn, but you never jump into the swimming pool. Okay, this is something important. So all this problem about what we need in order to industrialize is not a matter of sitting and, like Penelope, sitting and wait until we have all these wonderful things. You have to do it while you jump into the swimming pool. And basically, you have to create the necessity of that, because Chile's investment research in research and development is even below Brazil, is 0.3%. It's nothing. Chile invests 2% of the amount of investment in research and development done by Korea, 2%. And because we don't need it. In order to do extractive activity, technologies are so mature that why on earth you do it? And the 0.3% percentage point that we do in that, 2/3 is done by the government. So it's really something that you have to jump in the swimming pool. Okay, this is essential for that. Now, going back to now specifically to the question, which I'm really grateful because it's a subject and I have time to move into the presentation. The crucial thing here, first, remember who are doing the investment today on clean technologies is China. 75% of the investment done today on clean technologies is being done in China. It's not being done in Europe. So let's not idealize Europe in that sense either. Okay, I mean, China is a huge polluter, but it also knows that the future is there and they don't want to be first. And 75% of the investment done today in new technology, clean technologies, is done in Korea. But the crucial issue is this. We have to think how to change the green issue from a problem into a solution. This is the crucial issue. What we need in Latin America, where the extractive dual model is already completely exhausted, if anything it could do, it did it a long time ago. And all what we are doing is we continue with the same policies, even though their shelf life has already expired and they have become counterproductive. And we have to think how to re-engineering our industrial model. And one way is to move into the industrialization of commodities. But the other one is obviously the green issue. In Chile, for example, we have these huge mountains on one side, the ocean on the other, desert on the north, and the pole, South Pole on the other. So we're completely geographically isolated. It's the ideal country to transform all agriculture in organic agriculture. So that first are very profitable because European and advanced countries' markets are now becoming really conscious about that, and particularly now with the pandemic, forgetting the Chilean salmon that has 1,400 times more antibiotics than a Norwegian equivalent, 1,400 times more antibiotics than the Norwegian one, is going to find a lot of problem to be solved in the advanced countries. So we have to think the green issue from a problem into the solution. Another engine of growth that we can find in Latin America for our industrialization is to transform agriculture into an organic one. Stop using pesticides that we know they are cancerogenous. They are forbidden even in the US. But in Chile, we continue to do it. Monsanto continues to sell pesticides that we know they're cancerogenous. So if we really think about transforming agriculture into the organic agriculture, energy production into clean, sustainable energy production, the green issue ceases to be a problem, is a solution. Obviously, it's necessary. We don't have a choice. We have to do something. But if we do it, that in itself will become a really interesting new energy of growth. So let's think about the green issue of the next engine of growth for Latin America, as well as industrializing commodities, but doing so obviously in an environmental way. As I mentioned already, think about this: 70% of all the transport of copper from Chile to Asia is basically transporting slag. So of the 1,000 cargo ship that goes with concentrate from Chile to China, 700 of that is complete rubbish, is nothing. So when I tell my Chilean friends, when I want to annoy them, I ask them, what is the main export product of Chile by volume? And the answer is rubbish. Our main export product by volume is rubbish. I mean, can you imagine development models so absurd like that? All because we don't want even to transform copper concentrate in bars. So what we need is new engine of growth, industrialization on the side of industrializing commodities, and the green issue as the main engine of growth in order to transform a problem into a solution. Go for organic agriculture, for renewable resources, in energy, and all the rest that you know. Thanks.
Thanks. Professor Bresser, please.
Okay. Well, in relation to the question, look, I'm not against, I'm for industrial policy. But industrial policy for me is not the main thing. For me, the main thing is that the 5 macroeconomic prices are right, especially that the interest rate is low, that the exchange rate is competitive, and that the wage rate increases with productivity, that inflation is very low, and that the profit rate of the businessman is satisfactory, makes them to invest and to develop technology. And what the Dutch disease does is to make the profit rate of the businessmen in the manufacturing industry negative, so they don't invest, or very low. And then this must be solved. And this is a macroeconomic problem. This is a macroeconomic problem, and I know that's not the usual, it's not the normal macroeconomics, but this is the macroeconomics that I am trying to develop. Macroeconomics based in the 5 macroeconomic prices and how they should be made right, because the market is wonderful to, as I said, to make, to coordinate competitive systems, but totally incapable of coordinating satisfactorily the 5 macroeconomic prices. Well, now, one thing that I was very interested in the exposition of Jeffrey, and I thought that there is a difference between two, because he was very much concerned with investment in education, absolutely right, and Brazil is making an enormous effort in the last 20 years for that, and technology. And I agree with that. But what I would like to reason, Jeffrey, is that why productivity stopped, as Paulo and you showed? Why growth was so low in manufacturing in Brazil, in other developing Latin American countries? This was essentially because companies invested very little. And technology comes with investments. I was for a short time a minister of science and technology in Brazil in the end of the Cardoso administration. And it was funny because the state made more investments in technology, much more than the private companies. And 20 years later, same thing. One thing that I was very impressed with your sociological concern. Mr. Jeffrey, you are now also a sociologist, because you discuss very well the problem of the necessity of cohesion of societies. And you show that societies like Brazil, United States, and South Africa are not cohesive. And this is very bad for them. And cohesiveness depends on race and to reject racism, depends on income distribution and reduce inequalities, but depends also on values. And one thing that I would like to tell you, Jeffrey, and all, is that I studied in the United States in 1960, 61, long time ago. And the United States at that time was completely different from what is today. I think that in political and cultural terms, there was a major regression in the United States. was the loss of cohesiveness, because for instance, I was present seeing the debate of Kennedy and Nixon in the television. And it was impressive because that's two extremely smart, intelligent politicians. They agreed in everything. No. Now, nobody agrees with anybody. And I have one explanation. I'm sorry for coming to this, but I think maybe it's important. I have one explanation why the Americans were able to keep the cohesiveness in that time, when they were victorious in the war. That was important. They were a very successful nation, but also because there was a philosophical principle, the philosophy of republicanism. And republicanism, the idea that it's an antidote to individualism. The idea that politicians and citizens are supposed to defend their public interest, even when they are in conflict with their private interest. This was very strong in the United States in his whole history. And this was dismantled since the 80s, since Reagan and these things. And so I think that is, I agree, but now to come back to the Dutch disease and to the curse, this is important. The curse and the disease, the curse is more near this lack of cohesiveness. It's a socio-cultural problem also. But look, what I try to argue about that is that to solve the Dutch disease economic problem, it is simple, it's technically simple. To solve the cohesiveness problem, to help to make this society a healthy society, a good society, this is very difficult. You must also work strongly on that, but it's very difficult. So here we are. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, please.
Nelson, thank you very much. Thank you for all of that wisdom. I think it is true that there are two issues. One is what kind of economic instruments should be applied to address a phenomenon that we all agree on, which is chronic underinvestment in certain sectors, chronic underinvestment in rising technology, and so forth. And I like very much your proposals, and I like, but I would say it's a kind of industrial policy, and I would add in the continued investments in science, and you made good investments there. And again, by the way, I did a project for the Global Coffee Federation last year to look at the socioeconomic conditions of smallholder coffee growers. And the thing that really was the striking overall impression about worldwide coffee is Brazil's success as a technological matter. Not only that Brazil has a lot of land and so forth, but it's really the productivity increase in farming that's astounding. And when you look at it, it's very science-based, very sophisticated seed choices, very sophisticated planting mechanisms, and so on. So it's a good example, actually, of a technologically sophisticated, resource-based export of Brazil. You're on mute. You're on mute, Luis Carlos. You're on mute.
Oh, yes, but this is a problem in agriculture. They are profitable in not only coffee, but also the soybeans and the other cultures are incredibly efficient in Brazil because they have profits and they invest profits and in these as competitive sectors, and they increase productivity. In manufacturing industry, the best multinational corporations are living in Brazil.
So what happened to Embraer? I never understood the story of Embraer.
Well, Embraer finally, and happily to my point, they gave up. Simply they gave up. I don't know. I thought that they were making a very good business. I don't know the domestic internal problems involved.
But
I think
Embraer was a case of Brazil really having a very
Yes.
sophisticated, very globally competitive,
Yes.
advanced manufacturing product, which is not an easy one. It's one of the most complex ones.
Sorry, Professor Sachs. And Embraer, Boeing gave up because of this financial situation is not good.
Yeah.
Okay. And for me, it's a look solution for Brazil. Yes, a lucky solution, but to keep with Embraer. Yeah.
But I just use it as a, not even that's the specific question of what happened, but the example of Brazil's success over a sustained period in quite a sophisticated part of the world economy. So I want to come back to this question because I also, am so puzzled about the United States because it's not the country I grew up in at all. It's really in a massive failure. And when I was young, growing up, the New Deal was still the legacy. So the period from 1933 basically to 1968, you could even argue, even though Nixon was a very unpleasant man, even part of Nixon's term was a kind of politics of inclusion mainly. There are several things that broke it. And one of them was the civil rights movement, because when the civil rights movement came, which I think, of course, was extraordinarily important in history, it was the end of the Democratic Party's politics. And it was the opening for right-wing politics in the United States, which was very racialized from Nixon onward. He had the Southern strategy, which was to take what was a racist Social Democratic Party, because it was Social Democratic New Deal Party, except for blacks.
Yeah.
But once civil rights came, then they went to the Republican side. And so that was really the end of the New Deal period. That was part of it. And then one of the things that the historians show, I was just reading a fascinating essay. For some reason, the Republican Party also got taken over by the surge of evangelical Protestantism from mainstream Protestantism. And you can trace the polarization in Congress to that also. It's a very unusual phenomenon because our Protestantism we had a fundamentalist part, but it was basically rather quiet and apolitical and small, and a mainline Protestant movement. But with the rise of the South in power, the evangelical Protestantism came back, and that is an aggressive individualism combined with an aggressive anti-state philosophy. So the Republican Party became a evangelical Protestant party overwhelmingly, and that has its white supremacist roots, and it also has its extreme anti-government roots, which are connected historically, of course. The two are connected. And while Trump, of course, has no religion other than Trump as God, his whole political base is this evangelical, very unusual political base, which is about 20% of the population and about 25% of the electorate, and about perhaps 60% of the core of the Republican Party, which only has 35% overall support. But if you win the support of the Republican Party and the Republican Party somehow narrowly takes power, then you have this minority within a minority ruling the country. And it's sociologically also important to understand that Trump does not rule by legislation, he rules by decree. Almost everything is by decree. We've had one major piece of legislation since he became president. That was a tax cut for the rich. Other than that, everything every trade policy, every foreign policy, every other policy is by executive order, about half of which get thrown out by the courts 2 or 3 years later, but the rest persist. And so it's one-man rule in between elections. And one of the surprises that it's a surprise for me, how our legislation is filled with emergency powers everywhere. And so America's ruled by emergency decree now, which you don't think about America. This is why the Democrats holding the House of Representatives doesn't really change anything. It stops legislation, but it doesn't stop the actual policies, which are then made by presidential order and then maybe reversed by the courts. But one of the key interests of the Republicans is to dominate the federal court system so that you don't get a reversal there. So this comes to the question, what does it mean if Trump gets reelected? If Trump gets reelected, it is the end of American democracy as we know it, I believe, with a very real possibility, or at least the continuity of that democracy. Maybe we would return to it. But we're already in one-person rule. Trump does not have a majority, never will, never could. He came into power winning less than his opponent's popular vote share because of the Electoral College oddities. He only needs to own the White House and the executive rule. If he owns the Senate also, all the better, because then you get to appoint all the judges that you want. The House of Representatives will not go to Republicans under any circumstances. The Senate could become Democratic. Trump is trying to make an electoral crisis because he thinks that the bigger the crisis, the more controversy, maybe he can contest a bad outcome, maybe he can block a vote. There are many people who think that he may try to postpone the vote because of COVID or emergency or fraud or whatever, very familiar. This is part of our convergence story. So I think that even though we expect American institutions to be very robust, and I would say it's still odds on that we have, it is probably 90% that we have an election. And if we have an election, I would say 2/3 probability that Trump will lose. A lot could go between now and then because he's a psychopath, first of all. He is not a normal person. He's a psychopath. And second, we are already in emergency rule. We already have military troops assigned to cities against the wishes of mayors and governors. So he's playing with these powers very aggressively and claiming that he doesn't know whether he'll respect the election. It depends, he says. He says it. It may be dishonest, vote fraud, mail fraud. He's capable of saying anything, honestly. And he's not capable of saying anything honestly, but honestly, he is capable of saying anything. And so he's a very dangerous man. And God help us if he gets reelected, because the world will not remain stable. Not because the US is so central to everything, but because the US has 800 military bases and 6,000 nuclear warheads. That's why. So
I always claim that we Latin American should have the right to vote in the US.
Oh my God, the whole world should. Then we'd have no problem at all. I agree. We'll raise the idea. So all in all, I'm very, very nervous these days.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jeffrey. I hope you have better days, yes, next year. This is the only thing that
the Brazilians need this also, because we have our Trump here. That's And
I
I
know.
think it's worse than Trump.
Well, we're going to be able to get together to debate who's worse of the two. But we're
Okay.
next time we're doing it in person, this is for sure.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. But okay. So unfortunately, you need to finish because it's more than time. We are 5:13. Yes. And if someone wants to talk anything else, but I'd like to say thank you for you and for all the audience that stayed until this time. The debate was excellent, and I hope you can repeat it and all other times. And that's all. Okay, it's a great debate. I think everybody take some advantage of this debate, and I want to say really thank you for all the panelists. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for everybody.
Thank you.
Stay well.
Nice to meet
Okay.
you, Jeffrey.
Likewise. We'll do more together.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
Fiona, great to see you.